So nice of you guys to be here. This is the Deep Tech Summit. The topic before us is technology and society improving the human condition. Now, as a newsroom editor, whenever I ask any business leader, consultant, or worker about what one factor is driving today's developments, inadvertently technology comes up, but the reactions I get are often mixed. It's a mix of optimistic projections, it's also a mix of negative apprehension. Now, in the developed world, tech has refashioned our lives to a huge extent. It's fundamentally changed the way we work, it's created new industries, and it's also allowing micro enterprises to flourish. But of course, it comes with its negative impacts on the social, political, and business fronts. Now, the more we become more tech dependent, the challenge is the more vulnerable we also become. So here to talk to me today with me is three very distinguished guests. We have Jonathan Wong, who's Chief of Technology and Innovation at UNESCAP. Jonathan. There's also Dr. Robert Opp, who's the first ever Chief Digital Officer from the United Nations Development Programme. Hello, Robert. And Homer Pien. Dr. Homer Pien is Chief Scientific Officer, Diagnosis at Philips. Hi, Homer. So just before this, because coming right after Steve is going to be a really huge challenge moderating a session, we had a lot of time to talk about the topic backstage. And we talk so much about the human condition and technology, but what is one thing that really affects us? We discussed how, as a newsroom editor, my life has been completely changed by technology. It's the advent of the smartphone as well as the internet. I've got my phone with me 24/7, and it's increasingly very hard to fall asleep at night. The challenge also is that John Maynard Keynes had predicted that the human beings will work 15 hours a week, but many of us, I'm sure, work 40 hours or more every week. So the first question I'd like to pose our panel is, has technology helped or ruined our work-life balance?
Sorry. Both, I think. You're right. I think the reality for many of us in this room here is my boss has me on WhatsApp.
Oh dear.
as an example, I think there's that side of things. But certainly, I think this access to information that technology has given, not just to professionals like us, but to people like rural farmers in remote parts of Bangladesh, as an example, is opening up a whole world of opportunities. So I think there's both. And I think it's certainly, depending on which sector you work in, the development level of your country, I think you see this from a different perspective.
What about you?
So I think that what we see with technology is just an incredible acceleration. So that has amazing opportunities. So if you think just back a few years, where we were in terms of productivity and things, it's more productive because you can be connected from anywhere and anytime, and you're sort of accelerating the speed at which you can work. But at the same time, that is obviously not something that's natural to us as humans. So it is something that's causing a lot of that unrest. And if you can take that from the microcosm of the individual and you look at the globe, the exact same thing is happening with countries that are there in the so-called developed world that are accelerating very rapidly, and we see there's an acceleration to the acceleration, if you will, in terms of new technologies coming online. But there are others that are not involved in that are not yet plugged into that acceleration, and the gap is starting to widen. So we start to talk and see a digital divide, so that the benefits that you might see from the acceleration are not being felt equally, and that's of great concern to us as well.
I want to come back to that and hold that thought for a little bit, but I just want to get Homer's views also about technology and the impact of our work-life balance.
Well, so certainly from my perspective, on a personal basis, traveling around the world, just and we were talking about this in the back room, just in terms of dealing with jet lag, it absolutely kills your schedule, kills you physically. When we look at it sort of professionally on the healthcare side, the number, depending on the region, the number is somewhere around 60 to 70% of physicians we believe are burning out. If you look at it from a radiologist perspective, 25 years ago, a chest radiologist maybe sees 150, 200 images per day. Now they're looking at 15,000 images per day. So just the sheer amount of pressure, the workflow, the medical legal aspect of making a mistake And all of those pressures, it's creating an absolute distortion on this work-life balance concept.
Okay. I want to come back to the points that everyone raised so far, which seems to be about the differentiated impact on developed versus developing countries, but also within each economy. Maybe we can dive into that first. There will be leaders who blaze a trail, and technology has fundamentally revolutionized a lot of the ways and has been a force for good, generally speaking. But there are also laggards. And by that I mean the old economy being replaced by the new economy of businesses, startups. Perhaps we can focus into that first. What advice do you have to ensure that that gap doesn't widen when it comes to leaders and laggards?
Shall I go first?
Go for it.
I think there's a big danger when we think about frontier technology such as AI or the robotics, all these sort of things. Rob mentioned it, that there's a digital divide in this region. In Asia Pacific, half the people have the internet, half the people don't. Now, of course, all these technologies are built on this foundation. If we take our eyes off that and start focusing on the laggards and the leaders in the frontier technology space, I think there's going to be a new frontier technology divide built on top of that. Now in terms of laggards and leaders, I don't think it's all bad news. So I give this example. I'm from the UK. Now, we invented the train system. We have the worst train system in the world because you cannot build on top of that a new system. Now you look at Laos, which has never had a train line. They will soon have technology and a train system that far surpasses that of the UK, the people who invented it. You look in Kenya, where mobile money is now prevalent. It was the home of mobile banking. They had no formal banking system there at the time for very poor people. And again, they leapfrogged many economies. You look in the UK, where mobile banking took a lot longer to gain traction. It's because you had the institutions and the banks there already. People used to going to the banks, used to using checkbooks. So I don't think it's all bad news, but I certainly, there is a risk that if we don't deal with the fundamental digital divide, as Rob mentioned, this new frontier tech divide will certainly kind of unfold, particularly in this region as well.
And something that you've brought up, Robert, you mentioned about how there's a digital divide. Is it more accurately characterized as a two-track economy? In a lot of the major startup nations like Israel, we're starting to see a little bit of that come out.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, we're not talking about a geographical divide here as such. It actually happens within societies as well, or within countries and economies. I think just to pick up on something Jonathan said, bridging the digital divide, I think it's important to make a distinction between the concept of what's available and what's accessible. What I mean by that is the dystopian future of, kind of the acceleration of technology in these areas that becomes only available and affordable, or becomes available, but only affordable by a very few people. So you end up with the sort of the super haves, if you will, and then the have-nots. The issue is there will be availability of technology. There will be availability of connectivity. The question is, will people be able to afford it? And we have to look at the ways to build new business models that will allow people at virtually any income level to be able to afford the access to the benefits of the technology that are there. So it's certainly not all bad news. The question is, what is the model and the framework we use to help make sure that we develop that accessibility?
So Homo, I'm going to ask you to weigh in here. A lot has been said recently at the Business Roundtable about stakeholder capitalism and a new model for businesses. As the only private sector person on this panel, what are your views on that, hearing what Robert has said, hearing what Jonathan has said so far? Does business have a role to play, or is it still that chase for profits ultimately?
I think more and more the days of sort of Wall Street, just to stereotype a little bit, from the movie Wall Street, in which you would do anything for $1, I think to a great degree those days are sort of over. I think that there is much more awareness of the impact of business on society. And I think in that sense, there are many, many large companies, and even small companies, that take a much more conscientious view of the obligation that companies have towards society. So whether it's contributing locally, whether it's helping out on the education process, whether it's making sure that the technology is much more accessible, I think all those things are actually things that we do spend time thinking about, we're cognizant of, and we think we have an obligation to society to actually do something about these things.
So then, as a journalist, I always love to ask, how do you know that it's working? To be honest, CSR is not new, and a lot of it has been positioned as reputation management. A lot of CSR work has been parked under the public relations part of most companies.
Yep.
To what extent do you think there is a shift, a fundamental shift, and how would you measure success?
I'm not sure how we measure success per se. What I can say is, with the younger people in our workforce, the social message is becoming more and more important. So, you know, my daughter, for example, who went to a very good college, ended up working for a place, didn't really like what they're doing, so one day she just quit. And so I think for some of these millennials and even the generations, you know, around that, the social benefit of the job that they're working is really, really is a paramount consideration for what they do for employment. And so if we as a company aren't careful about what it is that we're contributing to, we're going to start to lose these new blood in our workforce. So it's absolutely something that's ingrained in our culture, in what we do, in what we strive for, very much so.
So I'm going to throw this over to both of you.
Thank you.
Go, you go
You
first.
read my mind. As part of your response to what Homer had said, could you also talk a little bit about what is the role of business in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and how far are we from achieving those goals?
Right.
Is there a scorecard you have?
Well, okay, there's a lot of questions
Yes.
there at one time, but because I did want to respond to what Homer was saying, but very quickly, since you mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals, for those of you who are not familiar, these are the 17 goals agreed upon by all members of the United Nations a few years ago, saying that these 17 goals will be achieved by 2030, and they cover everything from poverty, hunger, health access, all the way to life underwater, climate action, and human rights. So they represent humanity's greatest challenges, and this is where the United Nations system is pushing in terms of working together to achieve the goals. As to where we are, it's a mixed set of results right now. For example, poverty, extreme poverty is declining, but it is not declining at a pace that will get us on target for 2030. Hunger is actually rising. That's largely due to a set of conflicts that we see in Yemen, Syria, and other places. So it's a mixed bag, but almost none of them are currently on track to 2030, and that is to be achieved by 2030, unfortunately. And that's where we are very interested in using and leveraging technology and innovation to achieve that. So that's sort of one set of thoughts. The other thing to mention is that very critical to the Sustainable Development Goals is the notion that this is not an effort of public sector or the United Nations alone. This is absolutely a multi-stakeholder effort that has to be done together with private sector and public sector players, civil society, and others. So it is critical. And to respond to what Homer was saying, if I look over the last 10 years or so, there is a noticeable and very genuine shift on the part of many, many businesses to absolutely take the Sustainable Development Goals or other social impact-oriented goals and plug them into the business aspects, not just CSR. It's not always just corporate affairs. Sometimes it depends. But there is a noticeable shift in engagement and interest there. So that's absolutely true. And when we look at the startup ecosystem, we also see a lot of startups are started by young people. They have a very purpose-oriented push. So they want to find ways to very quickly take their business models that might be developed in Tel Aviv or Singapore or Silicon Valley and move that into a space that's serving the broader purpose of humanity.
This is my favorite topic, by the way. So without sounding too Wall Street again, I mean, I believe in capitalism. Capitalism has been good. I used to work in venture capital. Business has brought people out of poverty. It's put money in people's pockets. But actually, on the flip side, not so great for the environment. Social inequality, not so sure. Income inequality is at its highest it's ever been. And for me, I mean, people ask, I have innovation in my job title, I've had it all my life. I always say this, the biggest innovation that I believe can happen for the SDGs is for business to think about society and environment as well as the bottom line. That is an evolution in mindset, but a revolution in impact. Now, linking this back to technology and society, I think business are absolutely fundamental in the technology space for society for this reason. You look at the technologies we used in the third industrial revolution, so the internet, GPS. These were actually publicly funded. So it was actually DARPA in the US, the defense agency, who did the early research on the internet and GPS, things we use every day. Yeah. Now, the problem or the opportunity with AI, robotics, and these other frontier technologies is actually it's not public investment. This time it's private investment. And I think we really need to think about tech responsibility of corporations very, very seriously, because that will shape the direction of where this takes us. And I think technology will happen, the technological revolution will happen. The direction is not certain, but these tech leaders, the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world, are actually playing God at this moment in time because they're making these investments. And you look in the news just recently where you're having these tech corporations making decisions on what constitutes a political message or not, and whether to face that or not. Is that the right thing for society? So I go back to the point. I think the more businesses can focus on these society and environment alongside bottom line, could really revolutionize the SDGs. I don't think we're there yet.
So how then do you think big tech in particular, because when I look at the market capitalization of most firms, the ones with the biggest are all the big tech firms. You have Microsoft, Apple, Google,
Yep.
Facebook, and there's been a lot of discussions about Facebook's utility in society as well, especially with Mark Zuckerberg in Congress just last week.
Yeah.
So just simply, how should big tech work with governments and achieve those goals?
I don't think it's a simple question. I mean, there's a question of who is best placed to govern. So technology firms have all this data. Are they best placed? Are governments best placed? Question mark. I don't think it's as simple as that. Are the UN best placed? Maybe. I think it needs to be a multi-stakeholder engagement in all of this. And this is something that's certainly driving the UN, and this recognition from our Secretary General that not one sector will have the answer. Not one sector has the right to govern. But certainly a lot of different sectors need to come together because nobody quite knows what this will look like. But certainly on actually how do you go about incentivizing actually corporations and businesses to think more about doing good as well as doing well, shall we say. And recently we worked with the government of the Philippines on something called the Inclusive Business Accreditation Scheme, world first policy. Now what this scheme does is if you're a company, a tech company, whatever that may be, who is specifically focusing on providing products and services to the very poorest people in society, you get a 5 to 10 year tax break. Now that's a big incentive for a company to start thinking about society as well as the bottom line. So I think in a nutshell, I think it's got to be multi-stakeholder, but certainly governments can put in place policy incentives to help business think about doing the right thing, shall we say.
So Homer, I want to throw this over to you, again as the only private sector person on this panel.
Sorry.
There's much been said about incentives, but you've already mentioned how companies are incentivized to look to create societal good, to look to other goals beyond the bottom line. Do you see any positive examples of that shift taking place already?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots and lots of examples. So I'll give you some examples in which doing good is actually better for our business. So we make, for example, ultrasound machines. Ultrasound machines typically are large machines that sit on carts. They're a little bit unwieldy, and you have to wheel them to the patient and use it. And one of the things that we developed was a ultra-portable ultrasound. So this is now an ultrasound probe that you could attach to your iPad or to your iPhone. So it runs on both Android and iOS. And as we start to push this out into rural locations, into parts of sub-Saharan Africa, on the one hand, it provides access that they previously never had access to. On the other hand, for us, we get to see how these products are being used in ways that we never previously anticipated in the wealthier regions of the world. So it turns out that it's hugely beneficial to actually enable such socially good products, and it benefits the company. It absolutely benefits our bottom line doing things like that. We make these massive MRI machines that weigh, that has the same weight as a Cadillac SUV. It's got lots and lots of iron in there. We're trying to make these systems 100% recyclable. And in doing so, we recover a lot of the materials. We recover some of the sunk costs that have gone into building this machine that now has no clinical value associated with it, but there's still a residual value associated with it because of the materials in there. So these are examples in which, very simplistic examples, but these are still examples in which what we seem to be doing are the socially right things to do, yet it absolutely benefits our bottom line.
So you brought up a really good point about how technology can be used to improve the lives of others. But the challenge that I also see, and you've brought up climate change, so we're going to go there. Climate change is one of those wicked problems that we've often heard about, more recently, more so. And a lot of things have been said about how technology can be an enabler with the move towards solar, the move towards new technologies, electric vehicles even. But isn't technology the very problem in the first place? That huge generation of industrial activity. Are we not just engineering our way out of a problem that can't actually be solved by technology? And the only way around it is to reduce our carbon footprint. Is technology the problem when it comes to climate change, not the solution?
Firstly, on the scale of the problem, it was Al Gore who actually told me this fact. I was in New York recently, and I had dinner with him, and he said, Jonathan, the CO2 emissions and greenhouse gases we put up into the air amount to 500,000 nuclear bombs going off every day. That's the enormity and the scale of the problem at the moment. And it was a very pessimistic conversation, but he ended with his point for optimism, which was this. He said, but what's interesting now is, for the first time ever, renewable energy is now cheaper than dirty energy. And he said, no, sorry, it's going to happen next year. He said, that's the tipping point. And he goes, that's when businesses will start saying, okay, we're not going to develop a coal plant anymore, we'll go for renewable. So I think certainly through the past industrial revolutions, it was absolutely the problem. As I mentioned earlier, business wasn't so good, maybe not so good for the environment. But certainly now I think technology will form part of that solution. But as consumers ourselves, I always say, businesses will react to what the consumers demand. If we demand cleaner, more ethical products, if we demand not to use the plastic bags, which I'm surprised in Singapore are still not banned in a country this advanced. I think certainly the consumer, as a collective, will have a big say in how the climate evolves.
So I would say we have to reduce carbon emissions, absolutely. But it's also, I think, not really realistic to expect that the pace of technological development is ever going to really, or going to be reversed. So I don't think it's a matter of kind of doing less technology development. It's actually maybe going in the other direction. And Jonathan mentioned solar. So if you look at solar for a long time, quite costly. It didn't seem like it was ever really going to take off. And then it hit that exponential curve in terms of reduction of cost for the generation of electricity from solar cells. And I think that we will see more and more of that. So it's not, I don't want to imply that climate change will be solved by technology alone. We absolutely have to reduce carbon emissions. We absolutely need to change our lifestyle because we should be thinking of planetary health, not just climate change. So it's the whole picture of what we consume and how we go about our lives. That needs to change. But at the same time, I wouldn't say that technology is the problem, therefore we shouldn't continue with technology. That's going to happen as well, and we want to reap the benefits of that, but we want to make sure the benefits are democratized as much as possible, and that we're really taking that opportunity rather than letting it get away from us.
I would simply add, and I agree with all the comments that have been made so far, I would simply add that I think it's easy to bucketize the things that we see. I think it's easy to say technology is a benefit or technology is a curse. But I think that the more complex reality is technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are social policies, there are political policies, there is legal things that all of these things surround the technology. Technology has done absolute wonders in this world. What have we done with healthcare, right? I mean, it's done amazing things for the world. But technology has run so far ahead of, again, the legal system or the cultural aspect of things that they're no longer in sync. So I think it's hard to point your fingers at technology per se, but I do think that we need to be much more cognizant about the impact of technology and make sure that society is actually ready for some of these developments. So it really becomes sort of a push versus a pull problem.
So I think we should end off the conversation, because I see the light blinking at me, on a positive note. We've talked a lot about the distribution effects, the unintended consequences of technology. If there was one area that technology ought to focus on, a wicked problem that it should solve, what would that be for you in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. There are many, but let me link it back to
Too many.
to this, the improving the human condition. As humans, we're deeply flawed creatures. So I shouldn't speak. I'm a deeply flawed creature, shall I say? And for me, I think there's a real opportunity for technology to actually improve ourselves. So let me give you an example. People always talk about, it's critical that we make sure AI is ethical and not biased. And for me, that's looking at it completely the other way around. We should be thinking about actually how AI could make us better people. Let me give you an example. There are algorithms out there that help you sift job applications, as an example, and they say, okay, here are the people you should think about interviewing. What I would like to happen is for me to actually continue to look through these applications, and for an AI system to tell me, Jonathan, did you know you have an aversion to shortlisting older people, and you don't like Chinese names? Because that would help me change my behavior. And I think that the biggest opportunity is for how AI can actually make us better people and better corporate leaders, better politicians, because that way I think we'll meet the SDGs.
So I would agree with that, but I would also say, and I'm not going to disagree with it, I would just add and say, there are many problems that we need to tackle. And I'm tempted to say it's the planetary health angle that we should, but instead I might say it maybe something around our governance systems. So the way that we engage citizens in political process is really important. And I do actually think that technology has a lot to offer that connection between individuals and policymakers. And the more that we can kind of have that communication, that two-way communication at an individual level, that is enabled by anything from AI to mobile technologies and others, I think that's actually a really important area that we need to look at, in addition to everything else, like hunger and climate change.
17 goals.
Yeah.
Homer, bring us home.
Being a healthcare guy, I am absolutely terrified about the impending healthcare crisis that we're going to have, especially in a lot of the Asian countries, relative to the aging population, and what that's going to do about the support system that we have. I will come back to my point earlier. I think I'm hopeful that technology is part of the answer, but clearly having the social structure to support the elderly, having the governmental infrastructure that enables certain things to happen, I think those things absolutely have to go hand in hand in order to solve this problem. But I am absolutely terrified about the increasing aging population and what that's going to do to our relative economies.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. It seems that on the Deep Tech Summit, we talked about how technology has to make us deeply human, more or less, to improve the way we make decisions, overcome biases, and build better, more resilient societies, especially in the face of an aging population. So thank you very much. Shall we give a round of applause to our panelists? Thank you.